all the way in from second, third grade to all the way until college, the information that I had about India was limited to, social studies class, one chapter that they would spend about 20 minutes out of the academic year. What would we learn about? Jatis. Then we would say, oh, jatis and caste. And then there would be someone that would say, oh, does the caste system still exist in India? And that was it. That was the conversation about India, about India's history, about India's culture. And that's why I feel so passionate about it, because obviously I had this exposure to something else that I couldn't clearly say and express myself. So I'm going to stop there in my own monologue. But I'm going to turn to you, sir, as someone who was an ex-director of an institution that has so much at play when it comes to not just revisiting history, but the implementation of what we're learning, our culture, and most importantly, our people and what they're absorbing. How important is it in an institution like yours, as you were, to make sure that our civil society and our leaders were prepared to make sure that the implementation of history, as well as what Indians were taking away and how they were impacting, was to you at that time, and what would you do differently if you had?
Thank you. And you see, at the Civil Services Training Academy, the challenge is what to teach and what to exclude. One is that there's been a lot of information overload on all the people who qualified the civil services exam, and there's been such an information overload for them during the UPSC preparation that as far as the Sarkari history of the country is concerned, they know it very well. Because as YSR, my batchmate, would tell us that the amount of information which those who cracked the mains exam, perhaps they are encyclopedias. I mean, they'll know everything about the country. So the challenge was on how do you discuss history with them. So what we did from last year, at least 3 years ago, was to ask them to, I would take a little session with them on events and institutions and personalities which to their mind have affected India from 1900 to 1947. So you would come out with Raoul attack, Jallianwala Bagh, salt satyagrah, the Caliphate movement and all these things. We put them all on the whiteboard. And then I would tell them that, no, look, now let's exclude this. And let's start looking at those events, those incidents, those individuals whose names are not mentioned here and who have yet made a lot of difference to the history of the country. And that's where, little names, I mean, not little names, but you come across, for example, the names of Kharabadi, who was in 1857 in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So that is how little history came about. And I think the challenge to our country is about little histories, because the way we've looked at history in India has been from the New Delhi perspective. In fact, the book that I've just written, it's called We the People of the States of Bharat. Now, that book is a story about the linguistic reorganization of the country, and that is about how states asserted themselves, about how linguistic provinces asserted themselves, and how language is not just a factor of cultural recognition, but is also a language of political assertion. And, the other part about our discussion is about retelling of history and about getting more and more facts. And I'll just take 2-3 minutes, because I'm aware that we are a very long, we have so many of us on this panel. I'll just take you to the States Reorganization Commission of India, 1956. Now, in 1956, the States Reorganization Commission went into the whole area of aspect of, how we can reorganize the provinces on linguistic lines. But one of the things which the SRC also said was, we cannot have very small states, because the defense, the first line of defense is with the state armed police. And if a state is very small, then administratively and financially, it will not be possible for the state to protect to be the first line of defense on the international borders. And therefore, while the 4 southern states were made, that is Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Mysore, and Andhra were made, Bombay, Punjab, and Assam were not divided, were not reorganized, although the movement for linguistic states in these places was also very intense. Now, that's another matter that, in 1960, the movement for Maharashtra and Gujarat, that created it. 63, Nagaland was created. Nagaland was created, and that was the first time when it was agreed that a state may not be administratively viable. But if a state is willing to come into the mainstream of the country, we'll accept that. Now, what happened was that after the 65 war, BSF was created. The Border Security Force was made because it was realized that if you have, I mean, you can't have the state police of Gujarat handling the run of Kutch. You can't have Rajasthan police having Barmer and this happening. The moment BSF was made, the logic for not giving Punjab had moved away. Therefore, when you reinterpret, so every event in history leads to something else. Now, the moment you concede a linguistic state, other states will follow. So the moment Nagaland was made, Meghalaya had been made on that day. The day Meghalaya and Nagaland was made, Arunachal Pradesh had also been made. And let me now, although historians should not do a forecast, but the fact that when Telangana is made, the future of many states which have one common language, emerging as two different states, is not out of the world now. It's going to be a possibility. Therefore, history has the ability to, every incident of history actually has in it the germs for the next changes, next set of changes that take place. I'll stop here because one can go on and on and on. So before the moderator tells me to shut up, I'll do it.
I don't think I can tell you to do that. But I would want to move on to Trivedi ji. मेरी हिंदी काफी बुरी है तो माफ कीजिएगा, मगर कोशिश करूंगा पहली बात ये सवाल हिंदी में पूछने की, और बीच में अगर इंग्लिश आ जाए तो माफ कीजिएगा। मगर मैंने शुरुआत ये की थी भी, हमारे पास अमेरिका में आधे घंटे का सहारा समय आता था और उसमें जो भी कुछ आपको देश के बारे में मालूम करना है उसी आधे घंटे में आप जानकारी करें। अब जब इतनी सारी मीडिया हाउस यहाँ हैं, ब्रॉडकास्टिंग वगैरह, और मेरा शायद सवाल ये है भी, अगर आप वहाँ वेस्ट में देखें तो आप NPR, PBS, इतनी सारी मीडिया हाउसेज हैं जो वेरी वेल डिटेल्ड हिस्टोरिकल, अगर आप कंपेयर करें तो अमेरिका की हिस्ट्री इतनी बड़ी नहीं है, मगर उन्होंने अपनी हिस्ट्री को इतना बड़ा बना दिया है थ्रू द मीडिया, राइट, थ्रू द फैक्ट that वो डॉक्यूमेंट्रीज बनाएंगे 1-2 घंटे की, सिविल वॉर की रीएनैक्टमेंट करेंगे, वो मीडिया पर आएगी, उसकी पूरी रिकास्टिंग रीस्ट्रीमिंग होगी। तो हमारी जो मीडिया है आजकल, जो मुझे लगता है, या तो एक इश्यू को एक्सप्लोर कर रही है और उसको, जैसे मान लो किसी ने टिप्पू सुल्तान के बारे में कोई टिप्पणी दे दी तो उसको बड़ी चीज बता देना, एंड देन ओनली द कंजम्पशन ऑफ मीडिया rather than focusing on telling the history of India has been the majority of what media does right now. आप पत्रकार हो तो आपके पास इतना experience है, तो what can media do differently to make sure that when we're rethinking about India's history, वो actual consumer पे जा रहा है, the hundreds of millions of people who are hooked on their broadcast TVs, who are hooked on their phones, whether it's in Hindi, whether it's in English, about the history of India in a way.
थैंक यू सुधांशु, बहुत अच्छा सवाल भी है। अभी सर जो बात कर रहे थे हिस्ट्री को लेकर भी और मीडिया को लेकर भी, दो चीजें, एक चीज मैं पढ़ रहा था, कहा गया कि जो लोग अखबार नहीं पढ़ते उनको जानकारी का अभाव होता है, दे डोंट हैव एनी इंफॉर्मेशन, और जो लोग अखबार पढ़ते हैं, अखबार का मतलब केवल अखबार की बात नहीं, अखबार और टेलीविजन दोनों की, मीडिया की बात कर रहा हूँ, वो मिस इन्फॉर्म होते। तो अब इसमें से हमें तय करना होता है कि हमें जानकारी का अभाव रखना है या गलत जानकारियों के साथ चलना है। ये ओवरऑल मीडिया का हाल है, बेसिक, ये सच बात है। और मोस्टली मीडिया इज टीआरपी ड्रिवन नाउ इट इज। जिस चीज में टीआरपी मिलती हो उस पर हम लोगों का फोकस होता है। हम लोगों का मतलब सभी लोगों की बात है। आपने सहारा समय का जिक्र किया, मैंने सहारा समय में भी काम किया, एनडीटीवी में काम किया, जो एनडीटीवी पूरी दुनिया भर में हम लोग ने जहां भी जाते थे तो लोग देखते थे। तो वक्त के साथ बहुत सारी चीजें बदली है, टीआरपी को लेकर इतनी सारी चीजें हो गई हैं कि जो लोग देखना चाहते हैं। एक जमाना हुआ, जैसे आपने एकता कपूर से शुरू किया, तो एकता कपूर भी दूरदर्शन के हम लोग से निकल कर आया था, क्योंकि लोगों को लगा कि नहीं, ये हम लोग हिंदुस्तान नहीं है ना। एकता कपूर का जो हिंदुस्तान था वो भी लोगों की डिमांड से आया, लेकिन अब उससे भी लोग बदल गए। वही हालत मीडिया की हो रही है कि हमको लगता है कि नहीं, धीरेन्द्र कृष्ण शास्त्री उर्फ बाबा बागेश्वर धाम सबसे ज्यादा चल सकते हैं, तो फिर प्रोफेसर साहब का इंटरव्यू दिखाने का क्या फायदा। दैट्स द बेसिक थिंग। लेकिन इंटरेस्टिंग बात है हिस्ट्री को लेकर, जैसे आपने जिक्र किया, तो एक किस्सा मैं सुन रहा था। एक बौद्ध भिक्षु थे, मॉन्क थे, बौद्ध मॉन्क, वो ट्रांसलेशन कर रहे थे, किसी सब्जेक्ट पर ट्रांसलेशन कर रहे थे, तो किसी शब्द पर वो अटक गए। तो उनके पास जो कॉपी थी वो थी फोटो स्टेट कॉपी। तो उन्होंने कहा, जब मैं ट्रांसलेशन ही करना है तो जो ओरिजिनल कॉपी है उससे क्यों नहीं करूं। तो वो सलाह में गए, गोदाम में गए और वहां से उसकी ओरिजिनल कॉपी लेकर आए और उसमें जहां वो अटके वो शब्द था सेलिब्रेट, लाइफ इज टू सेलिब्रेट, है ना। और जो ओरिजिनल कॉपी थी शास्त्र की उसमें लिखा हुआ था लाइफ सेलिब्रेट, सेलिब्रेट। तो यही हमारे हाल है हिस्ट्री का, सेलिब्रेट से सेलिब्रेट तक आ जाते हैं हम ट्रांसलेशन करते करते, समझे। और हिस्ट्री तो आजकल ऐसा सब्जेक्ट हो गया कि उस पर जंग हम कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि हिस्ट्री को लेकर हिस्ट्री री रिटर्न होनी चाहिए। यही एक डिबेट अब बड़ी शुरू हो गई है कि जो हिस्ट्री लिखी गई, सर ने कहा कि छोटी छोटी चीजें जो आजादी की लड़ाई में रही उनको हमने इग्नोर किया। अभी हम फर्स्ट पेज में चल रहे हैं जिसमें हमने कहा कि जो बड़ी बड़ी चीजें हमने पढ़ी, जो यूपीएससी के एग्जाम में सर ने कहा कि बहुत सारी इंफॉर्मेशन हमको मिल जाती है सरकारी हिस्ट्री से। अब वो तो सरकारी हिस्ट्री पर ही सवाल है कि क्या वो सरकारी हिस्ट्री सही है कि नहीं है। मैं उस पर सवाल नहीं कर रहा कि गलत है सही है, लेकिन ये सवाल खड़े हो रहे हैं। अब तो सवाल ये भी खड़ा हो रहा है कि सिर्फ गांधी ने आजादी दिलाई कि नहीं दिलाई, ठीक है। तो अब हिस्ट्री को लेकर, पूरी हिस्ट्री रीराइटिंग को लेकर भी एक पूरा का पूरा फोकस कॉन्सेप्ट हमारा चल रहा है, उस पर काम कर रहे हैं। ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ऑफ रीऑर्गेनाइजेशन ऑफ स्टेट्स की बात हुई तो वो भी बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग रहा। पहले बात हुई कि लिंग्विस्टिक होंगी, लेकिन आप देखेंगे तो 10 स्टेट्स ऐसी बन गई जिनका लैंग्वेज से कोई लेना देना नहीं है, जिसका जिक्र आपने किया तेलंगाना का किया, उत्तराखंड का कीजिए, झारखंड का कीजिए, छत्तीसगढ़ का कीजिए, ठीक है। और बॉर्डर स्टेट्स थी तो उसके बाद आपने पंजाब को तोड़ा, हिमाचल बनाया, हरियाणा बनाया, महाराष्ट्र को कर्नाटक में शामिल किया और हिस्सों में भी शामिल किया। तो वक्त के साथ हम बहुत सारी चीजें बदलते हैं। और जब ये बात की गई कि डिफेंस के लेवल पर स्टेट्स छोटी नहीं होनी चाहिए, तो फिर डिबेट शुरू हुई कि एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव लेवल पर स्टेट्स की छोटे होने की जरूरत है। लखनऊ और रानीखेत में 550 किलोमीटर का डिस्टेंस है। यदि आपको डीएम से साइन करवाना कि कोई कागज पर लखनऊ में साइन करवाने तो 550 किलोमीटर कैसे जाएगा, तो वो भी हुआ। फिर डिफेंस की बात हुई तो बीएसएफ की बात हो गई कि बीएसएफ हम बना देते हैं। और जब बीएसएफ की बात हुई तो फिर कहा कि हम 50 किलोमीटर और भेज देते हैं आगे। बहुत सारी चीजें ऐसी हुई हैं जिन पर डिबेट करनी चाहिए। लेकिन हिंदुस्तानियों की, माफ कीजिए, एक खास बात है कि हमको कारपेट्स बहुत पसंद है और कारपेट्स के नीचे हम सिर्फ चीजों को रखना पसंद करते हैं। यदि आम हिंदुस्तानी के बेडरूम्स में बेड्स देखें तो उनके बेड के नीचे, वो बेड तो होगा 50,000 रुपए का, लेकिन उसके नीचे बहुत सारे कागज रखे हुए। और ये आदत हमारी हिस्ट्री को लेकर, ये आदत हमारी कल्चर को लेकर, ये हमारी आदत सब चीजों को लेकर है कि जिससे भी हम डरते हैं सवाल का जवाब देने को, उसको कारपेट के नीचे रखते हैं। Thank you.
Very well said. Now I'm going to move on just for the sake of time. Shalini ji, I have a question. As a novelist whose primary audience, I would assume, is this new age crowd. You wrote a book about the IT sector. If I'm not mistaken, your background is also from the IT world. Look, Bangalore is flashy. Bombay, the life of a corporate kind of executive or someone that's working up the ladder. How do we cater our history and kind of the absorbing of it, the consumption of it, to a crowd like us? If people are aware, there are 670 million people below the age of 25. The Election Commission of India says, yes, 670 million. That's twice the demographic of the United States, just of people below the age of 25. The Election Commission of India says that people between the ages of 18 and 29, there are about 100 million who are supposed to be voters. So 10 crore are supposed to be voters that are not voting, like that young crowd. So, they're consuming things. We're consuming festivals. We're consuming, divine rappers. We're consuming Bollywood and Indian regional cinema, pop culture, but we're not consuming our history. And how do you, first of all, what's why? And B is, how do you change that?
Right. First of all, good evening, everyone. I'm truly honored and humbled to be part of Kalinga Literary Festival this year and to be speaking alongside an esteemed panel of writers and historians today. So thank you so much for that insightful question, Sudhanshu. Coming to it, I would say that, the purpose or intent with which we should revisit our history, as youngsters, is important because there are various reasons for it. For instance, if we take representation, right? It's not enough that what we learn in our history textbooks when it comes to our daily lives, we're not able to relate to it, right? So, and I'd like to share a personal anecdote, which I believe would, it relates to the topic that we're speaking today. I recently found out that one of my ancestors was closely involved in the freedom struggle, during the British rule. His name is Bhim Rao, and he strongly fought against the British rule in India, and he was captured. In order to escape imprisonment, he chopped off his own hand, and he came to be known as Mandgai Bhim Rao, which literally translates to blunt-armed Bhim Rao in Kannada. And he was a local hero during his period of time in the northern region of Karnataka. But his story was lost among a sea of other stories, that we learned in our historical history textbooks while we were studying. So the reason I'm sharing this anecdote today is because, if one of my family members had not decided to dig deep into our own ancestry or into our family history, the story would have been lost, right? And I'm sure most of us today, if we look back into our history, if we dig a little deeper into our past, I'm sure most of us will be surprised to know that our ancestors were closely related to some of the major historical events of the past. And so their contributions to history becomes important, and they deserve recognition. And through this recognition is what, that's where we come in, and that's where we are able to relate to our Indian history and our culture. And like you also mentioned, there are a lot of cultural practices that are being lost over a period of time. And it's important that to go back and realize the significance of these cultural practices that had for the people during that period of time, and to revive it so that we are able to not only understand the significance of these cultural practices, but we're also able to celebrate it. So another reason I would say, it is important for us to revisit history is because of all the archaeological advances that we're facing, that we're discovering over the period of time. So it becomes important to revisit history, and because these archaeological advances or evidences could eventually prove that they could change narrative of revisit history because of these reasons. And also as a writer, I would say it's important for us to go back and look at history from the point of view, from the perspective of empathy, and not just from an analytical point of view, so that we are able to truly understand the impact that certain historical events had on people during that period of time, which is what would give us a sense of relatability, and that's how we'd be able to relate to our Indian history, and we'd be able to contribute to our, we know where we are coming from, and that's how we'd be able to contribute to the future of our country.
I think that's a perfect segue, and I'd like to move the conversation forward, is when you're talking about, having more empathy towards what has happened in the past and trying to relate to it, it gets a little messy. There's a side, everyone has one, everyone's a victim, everyone's a perpetrator, etc. So when it comes to the kind of the interpretation and the reinterpretation, I'd like to ask our next panelist isn't that a little tricky when it comes to kind of reflecting back at our history and then interpreting it, and what does it even mean to reinterpret, right? And what's the causation of that reinterpretation as a society as a whole, from the media and the consumption of it to, let's say, communal harmony in that way. Just some quick thoughts on that aspect.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the hospitality in Bhubaneswar. It's my first time in the city. I've been 18 times to India, but my first time to Odisha. And it's truly a fantastic state. Thank you very much. I feel compelled to defend myself on two aspects. I'm a writer from Africa, and unfortunately, when we speak about Africa, not many people understand why the Indians moved to Africa. And on the second part of why I need to defend myself is all the men are wearing suits and I'm dressed in a pair of jeans, so I'm feeling highly underdressed right now.
I've got my sneakers on.
So just to give you a bit of historical background, I've written a novel called Dalliance with Destiny, which has relevance. It dovetails very well with the theme of this topic on history and reinterpretation, because it covers a period of about 100 years and is set in South Africa and India. So does history need to be reinterpreted, and how do we go about doing it? I think, first of all, with the advent of the internet and knowledge being spread far and wide through more sort of access to it via the social media, I think kids, teenagers have greater access. Besides that, the old tradition of, nani, nana, dadi, dada telling stories, that's dying away, because in South Africa, we hardly have extended families anymore. So there's a plus and there's a negative as well. If you look at where I think history should be reinterpreted, just to give you a bit of background as to why the Indians went to South Africa, it wasn't just South Africa. The first batch was sent by the British Raj in 1834 to Mauritius, and then that was followed by South Africa, Trinidad, British Guyana, Suriname, the Seychelles, and Fiji. So we were that very initial batch in the 1800s who went. Hence, I have an accent, a South African accent. I don't speak Hindi. At least you can speak Hindi, because I'm probably fourth or fifth generation Indian. So we were told when we were sent away from India, I'm from UP, I'm originally from UP in terms of my ancestry. We were told that, they were suffering, there was no money, there was no food. Yes, there was a drought, but they neglected to say, when we studied history in school, that the British Raj had also taken out 45 trillion US dollars out of India, that they had stolen the money. They didn't say that there was not many people volunteered to come to Africa. A lot of them had sacks thrown over them and they were kidnapped. Families were separated. When they went to the port in Calcutta, some brother may have ended up in Mauritius, somebody would have ended up in Trinidad. So that's how they were separated, because they were lied. So the second aspect that I think, where we need to look at history, especially from a South African Indian context, and we were told that there were riots in 1949 in the city of Durban, where I'm from. And this happened between the Indians and the Africans. And we were taught that, it was just a general riot that happened because the Indians and Africans were not seeing eye to eye and they were antagonistic towards each other. That was as far from it was segregation and pre-apartheid from the white government. So they actually catalyzed the riots in the city to drive a wedge. The typical British or European way of divide and rule. That is what happened. So they divided the black and the Indian in the country and in the city, and we still face that after effects now. So the same thing can be said for, if you look at Winston Churchill, he's made to be a hero of World War II. But nobody speaks, well, until recently, about how he created a famine in Bengal when he redirected the grains to Britain, and millions of Bengalis died. Same with General Dyer, after killing so many people, Colonel Dyer, after killing so many people in Amritsar, he went to Britain as a hero. So does history need to be, is it fact or fiction? I think it's neither. I think it's a matter of interpretation. And there's a wonderful African proverb that you probably heard that sort of captures this fantastically. It is only when the lion tells the tale will history be rewritten. And I think that should hopefully answer your question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Now, moving on. Yeah. Dr. Murthy, we can talk about this here as practitioners, as people that are working in different aspects, but you have a greater sense of responsibility because you lead a university, if I'm correct. And my question to you is two-faceted. One is, how do you ensure, because I think I tour universities and colleges, and everyone is really, really interested. A majority of them, I won't say everyone, but a majority of them is really interested in, for good measure, to get a job, most likely in the IT, most likely in the science fields, do well for themselves. The concept and the focus on humanities, whether it is a social sciences school or not, specifically history, to me and to where I've seen, whether I've gone to schools in Sonipat, I've gone to the IITs, and I get it there as well. But there's not a big focus on teaching history, right? There's not a big focus on making sure that our students, whether they're at the college, collegiate level, senior secondary level, what they're coming out of. So one is, how do you, as your personal responsibility, ensure maybe within your university and outside that people have that consumption? And the second question is what's your assessment on these young people, right? Are they actually interested, and I hope I'm wrong, about getting that pay package, getting the IT firm and working up the corporate ladder, and skipping the focus on learning more about their history, learning more about their country and this culture and identity that we have? Or do you think people are interested in it? It's just that the access is limited. And what I mean by the access is limited is when I studied abroad in colleges, and even though I had kind of like hard sciences and my majors, etc., there's always a huge component of learning about history, learning about whether it's IR, learning about culture, etc. And you could take as many classes as you wanted there. Very specifically, I had a class on Hindu-Muslim encounter sitting at Columbia University, right? And it looked not just at the text, but also like the practical implementation of the nuances that exist now. So is that viable / available in universities and in higher education here? And how tricky is it? Because every time you try to change a curriculum or you try to do something, protests erupt here or there, and how do you navigate that?
Thank you. Should we learn history or not? Is a interesting question. We need to understand the past in order to appreciate the present, and we need to understand both the past and the present in order to shape the future. And ours being a truly liberal arts university, we try to provide a holistic education. And in our first year, we teach foundation courses, a little mix of history and philosophy and a range of subjects. And after which students tend to choose their majors. So they get a taste of a little bit of everything. On that same token, I want to take off from the African continent where my preceding speaker left. It's often said that if we don't learn the lessons of history, history repeats itself. And we have seen that quite often. And in that context, there was in our contemporary history in 1994, millions of people perished in Rwanda, not through sophisticated weapons of mass destruction, but through crude wooden sticks. And it was kind of a horror which even United Nations and the international community are unable to reconcile with. And that was preceded by what you call campaign through media, through newspapers, etc. And it's again characterizing us versus them, targeting a particular community and terming them as rats or vermin who deserve to be exterminated. And the same thing happened in 1993 in the former Yugoslavia. The reason why the revisiting, reinterpreting is very important is that we see the use of hate speech. We still see hate crimes happening. Unless these are addressed, we see a lot of Islamophobia. We see anti-Semitism across the world. It's very important to don't understand in a true perspective. We will repeat the mistakes of the past.
If I can have the liberty to push you on that a little bit more, just because I haven't pushed anyone else. You spoke a little bit about the liberal arts aspect first, and how they have that option. So I guess, and you didn't answer my latter part of the question, is...
Carried away a bit.
Oh yeah, no, of course. Is, once, who decides what to teach, especially at an education institution? It's you can just put it there. I guess tea breaks are important. At an education institution, can we, yeah, or from at an education institution, who decides what gets taught? How do we make it as least controversial as we can? And then, when you're talking about this liberal arts, it's very up to the professor what they decide to teach and what they don't decide to teach. And since this is a panel on reinterpretation, on revisiting history, do you think it's a little left to individuals to make what they want of the history that they're teaching, the next generation? And how do we, if we should be controlling that at all? Just your thoughts on that.
Things have changed a lot. Actually, there was this national education policy of 2020 was a big, game changer, where there's a law. Today the students tend to choose what they want to study. So there's a range of minors which are offered, and depending on their interest. Earlier, it was the teachers who would decide what would be offered. But now there's a paradigm shift from teachers to the students, and there is a flexible learning, like anywhere, any place. We have taken on board Coursera, where students, if they want to take some courses offered by certification courses offered by Google, etc., they can take it, or the courses offered by other. So there are no limits to learning, and these days the information is freely available in Google and other places. So that way, it's not possible to steer them in a particular way. Even teachers are cognizant of their own biases, so they try not to bring those biases into the classroom when they teach. And so, a short answer to your question is that things have changed in India, particularly in the last few years, with the introduction of the national education policy, and it is the students who are choosing to decide what to study and what not to study. They can even take a 1-year gap year and then do something else and then come back into the system. There's an academic bank of credits, and it's all left to the student interests. And
right, that autonomy is different. Before I go on to the last question, I
just wanted to mention that there are two aspects about history. One is understanding the method of history, and the second is to study a particular aspect of history. So these are two distinct, interrelated, yet very significant points. I think at the honors level, the graduate level, is very important, and that started happening now with several universities. They're teaching the historical method. That is, how do you conduct research? And then it is left to the students and the faculty to delve deeper and then get into specific aspects. There is the granular aspect of history, and there is the historical method. Right? So the historical method is something that has to be taught formally. And what has to be done out of that method is, of course, an open thing. And that is what will open up the whole question about, the point that you made about your ancestor who had his hand cut and things. But you must know the method of studying. So the method of studying it has to be done systematically. And then what you study is left to a whole range of people.
And when you say systematically, sorry, I'm just really curious about what do you mean by that?
What I meant was, you see, the historical method. The historical method, for instance, would mean that you give equal importance to the written record, to the oral record, to the testimony, to the historical artifacts and various things. You just can't, there is a fundamental distinction between history and fiction, right? So that distinction has to be maintained, which means that if you're going to be writing about anything, for instance, if she has to write about her ancestor, she will have to certainly go into the records, look into the police record, look into the jail records, look into the medical record, and then talk to people around to say that, yes, there was a person who lost his arm or who cut off his arm in order to evade arrest. Now, when this point is established, then you come to the whole aspect of why were people being arrested? How were they being arrested? Was it very arbitrary? What was the agitation in which happened? Was it the salt satyagraha? Was it the Champaran satyagraha? So those are all the parts of the historical method. And all history, if it is not backed by sources, then then it will lose the credibility. And it's very important for historical work to also have credibility. You know, if you write a book and you're not able to say or justify why you have made a certain statement, then you are then you're writing a novel. Then you're not writing history. And there is a fundamental difference between writing history and writing a novel. Both are equally important. Now, when I say that history, it doesn't mean that novels and literature is not important, but these are two different genres, and their differences must be respected and celebrated. And there is scope for both, and both must flourish.
Now, I want to go to the last speaker by asking a question about the future in a way, and thinking ahead more so than the future. Is, you know, when we're thinking about revisiting history, what do we mean by that, right? And where do we envision it? How far do we go as in terms of where do you see us looking back and revisiting history, and where we end up?
Good. Even though I am not the history student, because I am interested in architecture, my most of work of 2 decades on based on architecture, but it's part of history only. So the main our orientation is to explore the archaeology, the architecture developed in India. Basically, I'm working on in Karnataka architecture.
So even in that case, then in terms of, you know, if we're looking back at you know, as architecture and what it means for our history and objects and what they mean, what are your opinions and thoughts about how we can kind of revisit those objects and what they tell about history within India and this land? So when you say as architect, as looking into kind of the architectural field, and revisiting history as an objects, temples, whatever. So I'm curious, when you revisit, you're looking at it through these objects. What does that tell you, and what are your assessments on how we revisit history through objects?
Our main intention is that like only. So there is a lot of research work is going on architecture. So we are doing also last 20 years on the research work only. So mine want to reach the people. So in a different level. So whenever the persons or the student when they visit a temple throughout the India, simply has to identify the structures and the difference of the structure. For example, if you visit the temples in Orissa, so when you visit the temple of Puri or in the Sakshi Gopala temple, you should be capable of observing the difference between the Sakshi Gopala and Puri. There's definitely different structures are there. So in Karnataka, why we are concentrating on Karnataka temples? So why in Karnataka temples there much we are concentrated means in Karnataka there is much influence of the northern styles, so we called Autareya and Dravida style. So in Karnataka the mixture is developed called Autareya Dravida. Well, after 10 years, are very Autareya styles in Orissa, Madhya Pradesh sections, and Dravida styles in Tamil Nadu. So in Karnataka, there is some different structures are developed due to their own stone structures, and they reach the architecture, everything. So we are more working, and so whenever the persons visit, any students or any person in common people, they should be identified. Even come to Orissa, even come to Madhya Pradesh, even come to Tamil Nadu, even come to Andhra. So they have exactly find the differences, why this is the temple, how these structures are developed, how the architecture as the Indian has grown.
Perfect.
Yeah. When we are talking about the history, revisiting, rewriting something, I just wanted to know as sir said, कि novel और history अलग-अलग चीज है. I do agree on that part. लेकिन history revisiting का क्या मतलब है? History revisiting का मतलब ये है, या तो हम हिस्ट्री को फैक्ट्स नहीं मानते, परसेप्शन मानते, देन यू आर रिविजिटिंग और रीराइटिंग. फैक्ट्स को तो रीराइट नहीं करते, परसेप्शन को रीराइट करते. हिस्ट्री के 2 पार्ट हो गए. एक है जिस पर हमने डिबेट किया और अब हमको लगता है दैट वाज नॉट द राइट थिंग टू राइट, कुछ जो लिखा गया वो गलत तरीके से लिखा गया. इसका मतलब है कि हिस्ट्री परसेप्शन है. किसी जमाने में किन्हीं लोगों ने जो लिखा वो उनके परसेप्शन था, ये परसेप्शन ठीक नहीं है. वो टीपू सुल्तान को लेकर हो सकता है, वो वीर सावरकर, विनायक दामोदर सावरकर को हो सकता है कि वो रत्नागिरी में क्या कर रहे हैं, उन्होंने माफी वीर है या वीर है, तो ये परसेप्शन है. ठीक है. दूसरा, जैसा हमने कहा वो एक हिस्सा है कि बहुत सारी चीजें हमने छोड़ दी, छोटी छोटी चीजें, उनको जोड़ना, उनको लिखना, उनको शामिल करना ज्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट चीज है। लेकिन जब हम री राइटिंग पे कर रहे हैं, इसका मतलब है हम एक नए परसेप्शन से हिस्ट्री को देखना चाहते हैं। इसमें भी कोई बुराई नहीं है, लेकिन इसको री राइटिंग मत, रिविजिटिंग मत कहिए, ये परसेप्शन की री राइटिंग है। एक्चुअली यदि हिस्टोरिकल हम लोग देखें, मुगल्स को देखें, किंग्स को देखें, वो देखें, तो मैं समझता हूँ हिस्ट्री इज जस्ट अबाउट द पीआर वर्क। कितना बेहतर आपका पब्लिक रिलेशन डायरेक्टर था उस राजा का, वो उसकी हिस्ट्री को बेहतर बनाता है। तो अब तो बहुत फैशन आ गया, सर ने कहा एजुकेशन पॉलिसी में आ गया। एजुकेशन पॉलिसी में टीचर और स्टूडेंट की रिलेशनशिप पे नहीं आया। एजुकेशन पॉलिसी में एक नया पैराडाइम आया, नया चेंज आया कि क्या पढ़ाना है, और वो पढ़ाना हमारे परसेप्शन से। लेकिन इस परसेप्शन को आप डिबेट करके शुरू कीजिए, नहीं तो फिर वही गलती करेंगे जो पहले हुई। That's all.
Thank you so much. And before we open it up to the audience, so I just was going to conclude it. Earlier in the day, I had the opportunity to interview Navdev Sarna on his new book, Crimson Spring. And he says this, and I think this is very relevant to end the discussion, is in the prologue, he says, "These then are the facts. Even 100 years later, the facts speak for themselves. The before and the after is only history. Its recording, its interpretation will differ from soldier to civilian, from brown to white, from ruler to the ruled, from the historian to novelist. For every event in history is, at heart, made up of the acts of human beings, and its telling is colored with the different shades of pride, regret, ambition, love, pain, courage, and the longing that human beings carry within themselves." So I think that's a really perfect way to kind of summarize this entire discussion about how history is, at the end of the day, the history of human beings and their interpretation and their emotions. So with that, if we need to open it up to the audience, if there are questions.
If audience has any questions, yeah, sure. I'll get that.
Being a historian myself, masters in history, मैं कहना ये चाहूंगी कि शब्द को हिंदी में अगर समझेंगे, जैसे भी आपने बताया, the word is इतिहास। इति खत्म हो गया, एक काइंड ऑफ ऑलरेडी ग्रेडेशन कि आप किस किस चीज के ऊपर बेस करके हिस्ट्री रखेंगे। आप परसेप्शन बदलना चाहते हैं तो आपको उन्हीं साक्ष्यों के ऊपर परसेप्शन बदलना होगा। यू कैन नॉट से कि अंग्रेज सब गलत लिख गए, यू कैन नॉट से कि फलाने ने गलत लिखा। यू गिव द सेम एविडेंस, फाइंड द न्यू लॉजिक इन इट, एंड देन प्रूव इट that this is wrong, what they wrote wrong. You are trying to confuse the entire new generation, and they will not know what is your history. Now the real danger has come. Without history, rudderless boat of India is the new generation.
I think there was a question right there.
Yeah.
Since we have an excellent range of people, the young people, the future, and we're talking about technology. In fact, my question is probably to the moderator. What do you see as the role of ChatGPT in retelling history?
Sorry, I just got lost when you said brought up ChatGPT.
ChatGPT.
Yeah, of course.
How is that possibly going to influence the retelling of history? Because
I wish I had given more interest to ChatGPT, that I thought this would come up. But Shalini and I think we both are young enough to go through this question. Then I might pass it on. Oh, age is just a number. So from what I understand, and I understand very little of it, but I think if it's not just ChatGPT, but AI in general, technology, the advent, I'm a consumer and consumer of history through YouTube, right? I got to know about history and got interested in history through Vox videos, through these people coming out and speaking and having really good graphics to explain a timeline. I didn't read history books. I did it through a visual perspective and consumed that. And that, in a time, was path breaking. So I think whether it's AI or ChatGPT in itself, this advent of technology will come in that will either make it more accessible or easier for people like us in the new generation, but also in previous generations, to consume culture, identity, history in a way that was inaccessible before. So I think that's just a standard time aspect of how technology disrupts things. I don't know. I haven't looked too much into ChatGPT. I've only heard the horror stories of Bing and AI. So I've been consuming it too much. I've also heard how students are now doing their homework on ChatGPT and have made their life easier. So I don't know if that's going to be a negative aspect, but maybe Shalini, you can speak on this as well.
So I have used ChatGPT. So I can say that it would just help in enabling to dig out the sources faster, to probably trying to get out of it. So it's it would make historians' lives simpler in a way that they would be able to figure out whatever the amount of time that one would require to go through all those source of documents. They'd be able to find it in one place. But again, it depends on how you're going to interpret it and the way you're going to query it, and then figure out what it is that you're looking at, what it is that you want out of it. Then it can definitely help, dig out sources.
Actually, one last thing, ChatGPT, there's someone who created Krishna AI. I don't know if you've heard about it. Some guy in Bombay, and basically they take the Gita and they act as if the ChatGPT is actually Krishna, and basically you ask questions about it, and it gives you through the Gita and through the Mahabharata and other texts that can relate these nuances. So I think that's kind of interesting of it.
So it sort of brings on this last point.
No, I was just saying, I would request to keep it a little short because we are really running out of time. Yeah.
I mean, this is about ChatGPT and how it can influence things, right? So our friend from South Africa talked about his first trip to Orissa. Now, there's actually an application that has come up where you type a city in India and say how many days you're going to be there, and it gives you an itinerary. So you type Bhubaneswar and you say 2 days, and it throws up a list of things that you should go and do, right? And that's telling you what to do. Now, it's missing out a number of things that are there. Now, when you're coming outside and you're retelling something, you're looking at AI to source a universe of data and then put it in a certain package where we as consumers will take it as the truth. Now, that's the point I'm trying to address, that you have a whole new dimension coming up. It's not just another Google. It is actually telling you what to do. And that's where in the retelling of history, that becomes an important aspect to consider. It's new yet, but it's surely going to be a force for the future, is my personal view.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, panelists, for an amazing session about history. I do believe that history is made of human stories, and no ChatGPT can ever replace human stories. So, yeah, thank you so much for an amazing session.
How will you have a panel?
Indeed. Thank you so much. Let's have a huge round of applause. We'll move on to our next interesting and the creative session for today. Definitely a session you must sit and actually listen to, because it's going to be all about poetry, Kavita Ka College. And we have a huge lineup for this. I'd request our guests to please take the seats so that we can move on. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. I